else, but I'll assume we're all
Yeah,
right.
the
Yeah.
recording has all started. Thanks very much.
Okay, great. So yeah, so this book's about that. I mean, this talks about my book on the origin of risk, which came out at the beginning of this year, and it's so first of all a bit about myself. I became interested in this subject of complexity science when I was a history undergraduate at Oxford. I read a popular science book about it. And I was completely hooked basically on this idea of complexity science. And I suppose most people would be familiar with that idea on this call. But I started working at King's College London and Guy's Hospital in kind of database technology for research, essentially. So research databases. Then I moved into local government and spatial planning. So I actually started doing an MA in spatial planning, and then I didn't finish it, but I ended up doing technology again, but this time in a spatial planning, departments in different local authorities. Then I went into retail software analytics. So I had a stint there. Financial software analytics. So I worked for a company called Confluence, which produced financial software for blue chip companies. Then I did a philosophy of cognitive science research masters at University of East Anglia. And then I moved to PPL. So I've been all what it's showing you is I've been all over the place really. So yeah, I've been working 8 years in music rights management. Again, all the while doing technology kind of jobs. And my next job is going to be for Raiffeisen International Bank in Vienna. So I'm moving to Austria. So if you ask kind of what's my expertise, I mean, you could say I'm an expert in the intersection of all these things, which is a bit of a joke really, because what is the intersection of all those things? I think that the thing that I've focused on is complexity science, and I've done a lot of work outside of my main jobs to research complexity science and relate it actually to my jobs as well, which I have done, to different degrees. So to kind of start the talk, what are we going to call risk? What's the way that we should understand this term risk? Let's talk about on the origin of risk. There is like an ISO definition, which I actually quite like, which is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. But obviously, it's such a big subject that each discipline has its own definition of things. And this is just sort of a definition by a committee that's probably biased towards organizational risk, I guess, or something like that. I think that a key objective in the idea of if we take this definition is the concept of growth while avoiding ruin, which is more the way an economist would think about risk or what they call welfare economics, where an agent is kind of trying to manage its own welfare. And that applies to an organism by this definition, or a population of organisms, just as it much would apply to human beings making economic decisions in an economy. There are different definitions of risk. So unquantifiable risk is sometimes called uncertainty, while quantified uncertainty is called risk by economists. So I've already broken that rule because I'm calling risk as basically the effect of uncertainty. And I don't particularly like this definition by economists that narrow down the definition to quantified risk, if you like, quantified probability of things. Mathematicians refer to probability as uncertainty, which is perhaps quantified, but we don't have confidence in it as a stable number, if you like, which is quite a technical difference. Versus they call likelihood a stable probability. So basically, there's lots of definitions, but I just want to think of this for now as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And that's what I mean when I talk about risk. So in terms of the origin of this book, obviously I talked about my career. It doesn't really give you much of a clue that I was going to write this book. But I joined a philosophy group, which actually kind of took off during lockdown after I completed my philosophy masters. And we were interested in economics, and we were interested in the foundations of economics and problems with that. And so this group was started by a guy named Nat Dyer, you can see in 2021. And he just invited a couple of people that he knew, and I was one of them. And he's ended up writing a book called Ricardo's Dream. So how economists forgot the real world and led us astray. And it's a really good book. And it came out of this philosophy group that he ended up writing this. Another member of the group was Erica Thompson. She's a climate scientist, and she wrote Escape from Model Land. Again, how mathematical models can lead us astray. It's almost exactly the same phrase, and what we can do about it. So there's this idea that we have models, for example, quantifying uncertainty and giving us models of risk, but they're leading us astray in terms of making policy decisions, for example, about climate or just understanding how the economy works. And so eventually I also wrote a book, which is this one, On the Origin of Risk. And it's a similar idea in the sense that we're not actually modeling risk probably the way that we could, in a way that would better deal with deep uncertainty. So we all agreed, this little group, which included a couple of other people I've not mentioned, to agree the need to kind of back out of our existing models of some of these kind of things. So the question is how to back out. Like, what's the way that you kind of like take an existing intellectual system and move away from it in some way, or try to change some of the basic assumptions? So my first hypothesis was that we have a bias, a deep bias in our approach to risk, which is shaped by actually our biological niche, basically the environment that we have evolved to manage risk within. And so obviously as organisms, even as individuals, we're kind of supposed to be interested in growth from an evolutionary perspective. We want to reproduce and we want to look after our children and our grandchildren. And obviously in economic terms, we're often trying to grow our businesses or our economy and stuff for the welfare of everybody, supposedly. But there's biases in how we do this, and one of them is that we're very visual creatures, and so because of the way that the visual world interacts with mathematics, we tend to solve problems in a way that suits kind of visual kind of aids to solving those problems. So an example is this graph. This is a visualization of a very abstract concept, but we readily consume this type of information, or at least we've learned to culturally. Also, we're tool making and using. We have central nervous systems. This all makes us unusual in nature, right? Compared to other species, and we're also kind of hypersocial. Therefore, we like to make complex predictions. We visualize the shape, if you like, of our plans, and we choose the best option or plan so that we can coordinate and communicate the best option or plan. And hopefully that'll be familiar. I know a lot of people on the call are interested in water management and stuff. I mean, hopefully this makes sense even from the point of view of obviously planning infrastructure. We tend to think that we need to make a complex prediction in the sense of a long range prediction. We need to then consider our plans against those predictions, and then we need to agree on the best option for this infrastructure, and then communicate and coordinate as efficiently as we can around the best option. And that would have been familiar to the Romans, as well. That would have been how they did things, So we tend to see maximizing the success in terms of dealing with uncertainty as following this process and getting everyone to agree and coordinate. And you see that in climate change generally, that this kind of unspoken assumption that the best thing to do is we all agree that climate change is the problem, and then we achieve a consensus on the most likely thing to happen, even though it's a very complex prediction. And then using that consensus to kind of incentivize and get everyone to agree and coordinate on some huge plan to solve, the problem of transitioning to net zero. And so we kind of then scale up our plan with more investment and more money and stuff. And if there are error bars around the predictions, that doesn't help with the next step, which is the plan and the coordination. So more uncertainty there is in our prediction, the harder it is for us to agree, to coordinate, to scale up. And so we see uncertainty as a huge problem, that we have to kind of reduce uncertainty as much as possible. Otherwise, we struggle, especially to do complex, coordinated action. But if you look at sort of other animals, organisms, such as a slime mold, they don't occupy the same niche as we do. They don't have central nervous systems. They're not social in the same way. They don't communicate in the same way. They're certainly not visual animals, right? So would you expect them to necessarily have the same approach to risk? And my suggestion is that they would likely have a different approach to managing risk. And that's kind of what the book is about. It's about investigating the possibility that we're actually looking at a small section of the options around risk management, and that in nature we should expect actually to see different strategies that may work better for other organisms. And what's interesting is that as an economy, we do look a bit like a slime mold. So what suits our niche as a small group of individuals or a small, even a town, doesn't mean the same strategy works for a global economy, right? Which does look probably more like a slime mold. So we're not necessarily using the right strategies to solve these huge global problems. So the idea really is that nature probably handles deep uncertainty radically differently to the way that we human beings do. So my argument is going to be that human beings try to squeeze out uncertainty wherever they can, even to the extent of ignoring it or pretending it doesn't exist. They could be simplifying assumptions. We could assume a stable probability distribution. We could neglect things we can't quantify. We could just remove outliers, saying that there's not enough information about them before we make our predictions. I'm going to argue that what I think nature tries to do is slightly different. It tries to exploit pockets of certainty wherever they remain. And so I'm going to explain. The rest of the talk is about explaining what that means, really. But if you compare the two statements, the top one sees uncertainty as a prediction exploitation problem, which again I will explain. And the bottom one assumes that uncertainty reduction is the main solution to exploiting predictions. That is, the smaller the error bars, the more useful the prediction. The wider the error bars, the less useful it actually is, and it can't be exploited because there's too much uncertainty around the prediction. But in nature, I don't think it really works like that. I think we're looking at a different kind of approach to uncertainty, which doesn't actually try to reduce it necessarily. So as part of writing the book and kind of my own research that I've done over, quite an extended period of time, to be honest, one of my discoveries was that there's old and young maths, right? And this probably makes a difference when we're looking for new ways of thinking about risk. So what I would describe as old maths is dynamical systems, thermodynamics, networks, because this stuff was explored in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries and has been heavily, analyzed and explored and developed. It's very good at describing systems because it comes out of mainly physics, which is all about describing systems in which there's no agent or the observer is completely detached from the system. So we can just look at it objectively. And it leads to things like chaos and complexity dynamics and stuff. But there's new maths, right? So 20th century maths is computer theory, information theory, and in terms of rigorous development, game theory. And so maybe this maths is where we should look for actually modeling the problem of prediction exploitation, as in how do we exploit predictions. And so the kind of maths is kind of computing and agent-based computing and AI and stuff like that. So I've taken a picture of a scene from Blade Runner. But I think that when we think about the future and we think about technology of the future and maths of the future, if you like, we tend to think of silicon and we tend to think of computers. But really, when we look at the future, we should think of biology. We should think of understanding biological systems as the new mathematics of the future, because that's the stuff we do not understand, but we know is real, So what are the ways that I think that other organisms in different niches actually exploit predictions rather than just squeezing out uncertainty? There are options for describing organizational systems, and I'm going to go through three options. One is what I call monomodularity. And so this is the way that human beings exploit stable predictions, which is that we have a model to integrate the way of comparing options and making predictions and then exploiting that. There's also something human beings are familiar with, which is multimodularity, which you do see to some extent in nature as well. And multimodularity is also familiar to technology, and that's where we exploit stable predictions, but at a lower level, there are options to change the system and swap out components. And that's how we build things that can be renewed, that can adapt to changing information, where components can be swapped out. So here I'm thinking about risk as you'll notice as an organizational problem, which is the first step to thinking about risk in a more general way than we normally do. But what I think is prevalent in nature but not seen in human solutions or technologies is metamodularity. So metamodularity, what is that? This arises from organisms under natural selection where there's no consistent assumptions, rules, or plans that would govern like a monomodular system for comparing options, for comparing plans. Growth is differentiated or stressed, but can exploit pockets of certainty. And so this is what I'm going to argue is the main alternative strategy, or the trick, if you like, that human beings are missing. And this is what I think is what we see in nature. And the difference between these three different forms of organization is that monomodularity and multimodularity work in a high certainty world, and they can be exploited in a way that we really understand very well as human beings, especially in the modern world of technology and computer technology, but also engineering. Whereas this type of technology, which is what I'm calling organisms and their organizational solutions, they work in a low certainty world where prediction exploitation is the maths that we care about. So to understand this system, we do need new maths to be able to model it. So just to sort of go into this difference between what we have now in terms of mathematical systems and what I'm talking about as what biological systems do differently, we can think about this idea of metamodularity in terms of existing systems. And the simplest way that human beings have developed to be sort of weakly metamodular is voting systems. So if you have all these beans, guess the number of beans in this jar, we know that if you just ask enough people to guess, the guesses will vary over quite a wide range. But if you take the average, it tends to be very close to the actual number. And obviously that's the principle also of a jury. So this is a picture of a jury from the 19th century. But notice that this is kind of a weak metamodularity that we see in engineering solutions at the moment. And the reason it's weak is because it's very assimilative. It tends to wash out the actual diversity. So taking an average does not reflect all the information that might be in that system. And if we just take a jury vote, we obviously over the 150 years or so, we've broadened the conditions that allow people to be on a jury. So now women can be on juries, which is obviously a big step forward. But how much difference does it make to the system that we have supposedly more diverse opinions on the jury? Because at the end of the day, they all still have to just agree a majority vote. And so this diversity kind of gets washed out in the system of just taking a vote. But this is how lots of our inferential statistics and the way we manage risk is based on this very weak form of metamodularity. So nature does not assimilate, is what I will argue, but instead exploits pockets of certainty. And so an example of this, a concrete example is in Australia, there are these plants which actually have seeds that hedge their bets, if you like. The plant hedges its bets so that each seed is both a low dormancy and a high dormancy seed in different parts. And so I'm sorry about the photo is a bit fuzzy, but hopefully you can see the seed's got two different parts. And so we haven't just taken a vote and just sort of said, we'll go for medium dormancy, which would wash out the differences. We've actually incorporated into the organization of the seed two different models of what can happen in the climate and the conditions of the soil that could mean whether the seed is germinated on and grows or not. And so meta models integrate that systems that are potentially informed by information, but maybe mutually inconsistent, and so not comparable directly to each other. So we don't try to integrate the options to compare them and choose one. We have multiple options that are sustained. And so what matters is that the correct solution can be activated given the information that activates the model. in its own pocket of certainty. And so these meta-modular systems exploits these pockets, and that's what this bet hedged seed is doing. I mean, other plants have seeds where there's a variety of seeds of both type on the same plant, but this is an interesting example where the high dormancy and low dormancy seeds are combined into one kind of seed pot. So I just thought it was an interesting example. So kind of let's look at the maths in a little bit more detail now. What's the difference between exploiting pockets versus, for example, Bayesian reasoning, which I argue is simulates really, so it kind of weakens diverse models. If we have betting on a roulette wheel, sorry, can I check everyone can hear me because I haven't. Yeah.
Yeah, all coming through loud and clear.
Thank you. I just wondered. I just thought maybe I've been talking for half an hour without a cut off. Yeah. So great. So we have a roulette wheel, and we're interested in betting on the roulette wheel. And you might say, what's a reasonable starting assumption? Because Bayes has prior beliefs, and then they get updated as we get more information with the information to using the Bayesian rule for belief update. And so we start off with some prior belief, perhaps. And we might say when we walk into a casino that we just expect to begin with that the roulette wheel is fair. Now, the whole point of Bayesian reasoning is that if you are wrong, eventually you will be able to discover that and update your beliefs as you get information that maybe it's not fair. But you might start with the normal, which I've got here in the normal column, with a 90% probability that this is a fair roulette wheel, that it's not a kind of crooked casino. And then you'd have 5% probability that it's biased to red and a 5% probability it's biased to black. Now, that's one way you could start off betting and updating your beliefs. But another way is that you could be what they might call a cynic, like for Diogenes, a cynic who professes, not to believe anything as a prior assumption, have no assumptions. And so you might think it's equally likely in this case that the roulette wheel is fair, or that it's biased to red, or that it's biased to black. So now you have a 33% probability of all those things, and you start from that point of view. But there's a huge difference with those different scenarios, obviously, and most people would not want to be a cynic. And the reason is that if you're normal, you start off in a position where you've assumed some information, but you're close then to operationalizing the information you have. Whereas if you're and because all these things must add up to one, obviously you're starting off in a particular direction. Whereas as the cynic, you're starting here, which is nowhere. And so it's going to take you a long time now to update information before you know which of these things are actually true. And so you've basically weakened your confidence in all the models because of the diversity of beliefs you're trying to accommodate into what is really a mono model, not a meta model. And so some Bayesians will argue that actually Bayes is meta-modular, and they'll talk about distributions over probability distributions and all this stuff. But I'd like them to explain this, because to me, this does not express a very well-defined meta-model. It expresses a very weak form of meta-modularity. And that's kind of the problem with monomodular systems, or very weak metamodular systems like Bayes. And so all probabilities in each column must add up to 1. And that's why the more diverse beliefs, or just more beliefs you have, if you like, the weaker you believe everything. So you end up believing nothing. And this really matters, right? So I'll explain why. If you have a autonomous vehicle, typically the kind of solutions that we've seen that have been arrived at involve not one, but 2 agents. There's a normal driving agent, which is the autonomous driving system in normal situation where you're driving and everything is normal. It could be a very complex environment, but you're just driving normally. And that agent is in control of the car. But there's also an emergency braking agent. So it's another autonomous agent. It's on all the time. It's assessing things all the time, but it doesn't do anything except trigger an emergency brake when it thinks it needs to. Now, why have we arrived at a system like that rather than Bayes? Well, the reason is that with separate models like this that can compete potentially for resources in the sense that they take over the car from the other, they can have independent thresholds for action. So basically, we can have at any context, any point in time, right, a probability that we should drive normally of 0.6, right, and also a probability that we should, the red is meant to be 0.9, which is 0.9, which is that we're very close to an emergency braking situation, even though we're also driving normally at the say just before that point. And that's because with a true meta-modular system, we have separate models. These probabilities do not have to add up to 1. So we can have extremely diverse beliefs and they potentially involved in the same system. And then the only problem we've got is when do we define which model overrides the other? Now, in this scenario, it's straightforward, which is probably why we've done it in our existing technology system, because we know that an emergency brake should always override the normal driving agent. But in general, we might not know or have a simple way of integrating these things. And that's where the technology gets more interesting. And that's where it looks more like a biological system. So I've just kind of explained that. And we can also think of the emergency car brake as a separate stress response operating in its own pocket of certainty. So you've got this pocket of certainty idea that the emergency brake situation looks at certain information and disregards other information. It can be super reliable when it does that because a lot of the information it's disregarding is not relevant to the particular decision it's making, whereas the autonomous normal driving has to integrate far more information. So meta models can be more productive, if you like, or agile on any time scale where timeliness in relation to information exploitation has utility. And so it doesn't matter whether we're talking about milliseconds or whether we're talking about 10 years, the same principle actually still applies. And this timeliness means that we are interested in local predictions because the emergency brake is kind of local in the domain of information. Only certain information is relevant to it. But also short-term predictions tend to be more exploitable because there's more certainty there. But you need an organization that can exploit it, like the emergency brake agent. You need to be prepared, if you like, to be able to exploit a short-term prediction. So this is all about exploiting pockets of remaining certainty in uncertain situations. And then what happens if we imagine this car driving and then occasionally the emergency brake being triggered is that we end up tacking between different models so that at some point one model is in charge, at another point a completely different model is in charge. And this can happen in a true meta-modular system, not like a Bayesian weakly meta-modular system. In a weakly meta-modular system, the beliefs just change very slowly over time. So we move from one model to another, the Bayes would argue, but we do it very slowly. In this situation, it can happen very fast. And so we can look at the emergent behavior of the system by tacking, that's produced by tacking between different models. And so we can imagine this tacking process in a more complex function, not just emergency braking. But even in the case of emergency braking, you would see the vehicle switch from one model controlling it to another, and there'd be an emergent behavior, just like this can be more functional in the sense of something like a boat tacking against the wind, where you switch from one strategy to another and something emerges, another behavior emerges. And this is kind of the idea that I want to think about when we talk about a true meta-modular system, is sort of tacking between models. And this is what I think we see in nature as well. And so there's no prior plan whether to zig or zag, but there are local pockets of certainty that take control of the system. And so we reduce the abstract complexity of a true monomodular plan that predicts everything, because we factor out the complexity into simpler models that take over at different points in time. And so in nature, these pockets of certainty are what we kind of move between in order to make progress. So I have, like in my book, an example of this idea of looking at organizational problems in a way where it's very subjective how you look at it. You can look at it one way or another, and it's like a visual kind of gestalt kind of illusion. So like this is a Rorschach test where it's an ink blot thing designed by psychologists to get people to think about they're sort of unconscious. What do you see in this ink blot? You know, is it a bat or whatever, or is it something else? And I think we have a lot of organizational problems and risk problems that are like this, where there's different ways of looking at exactly the same thing, and different niches, organisms will see different kind of solutions. And so my example of this Rorschach test is a very basic organizational problem where you have the decision to either be at home or go to the park. And if it's sunny, you prefer the park, and if it's raining, you prefer to be at home. And there's a cost to moving backwards and forwards. So you're hoping to make some predictions to exploit those predictions. And as an economist, you'd have a utility function that you're trying to maximize. And so that's one way of looking at this Rorschach test, is to say you're just maximizing a utility function. And so the more uncertainty I can squeeze out, the longer I can predict the weather, the more efficiently I can make my decisions about where to be and when to be there and so on. For example, I can anticipate that it's going to be sunny in an hour, and I can go to the park so that I arrive just as the sun comes out. That seems to be super efficient. And we're squeezing out all the uncertainty in the weather. Another way, which is just as valid, is to say that we're conserving options and the capacity for change. And so the park option is one option, the home option is another option, and we're tacking between models as information becomes certain enough for us to operate in that pocket of certainty. And then what we'd focus more on is the organizational question. How can I minimize the cost of going between park and home? How can I maximize my options and the speed that I can easily switch from one to the other? Maybe I'll invest in a moped or something, and just or a little bike, and that is just as valid a solution. So when we look at kind of the weather and so on, there are different pockets of uncertainty that exist when we look at things. So one example is long-range predictions can be very reliable in certain respects. You know, so for example, the average rainfall could be quite stable in certain climates from year to year, even though the 4-day forecast or 5-day forecast is still not reliable. Obviously, you then have the next day forecast or the 2-day forecast, and that could be another pocket of certainty that exists in your weather prediction. And the two just operate at different levels and timescales, and they're different kinds of pockets of certainty that we could find ways to exploit. And so we need to kind of factor these pockets of certainty into things that can exploit them, or organizational decisions that we can use, or processes or systems that we can use to exploit those pockets. Even in highly uncertain environments, there are still these types of pockets that exist. For example, the long-term weather trend, like the average rainfall or something like that, or even volatility, or the current volatility, could be exploited by saying, well, we then know that we'll need a large budget to make changes to mitigate or change our infrastructure to cope with the weather, without knowing, even though we know that with certainty, we don't know when it will be used or in exactly which direction, because it's a volatility that we're certain about rather than a specific use case, you know, of an action. So I'm going to kind of finish by talking about water management. I do not profess to have any in-depth knowledge at all about water management, but I know that this group tends to be, or this whole subject tends to focus a lot on water management. So I'm just willing to take a punt on something to talk about water management. And I apologize if this looks awful, but I just wanted to try and give something closer to home. Yeah, apologies in advance. But one way we can think about water management is the spatial factoring of our models into local models that are spatially local. We can also think about temporal switching, or the tacking that I talked about earlier, where each model takes turns to be in control in its own little pocket of certainty. And that would be like the car earlier. But there is a spatial equivalent, which is what I'll talk about here, which is, for example, an electric radiator, where you have a heating system that's distributed, and you have local pockets of certainty about whether the radiator should come on in this room but stay, you know, and then it's separate to other rooms. And so you have this idea that you can have partially decoupled models because they're spatially decoupled this way, and then that they can exploit local certainty that might be, is ultimately information based, but it could be local information that they can exploit with greater certainty because they're closer to the information. So I get that that's a bit vague. I'll try and be more specific about this. But it's kind of like the principle of subsidiarity, which comes from politics, that you should try and make decisions at the lowest possible level, most granular level. But this is a way of saying mathematically there might be a way to sort of actually quantify what is close enough, what is a pocket of certainty where it's local enough to be more certain. So with water management, obviously you've got these different aspects of it, the supply and demand, and wastewater and treatment and so on. You might have two models. This is just a really basic idea just to try and illustrate the concept. You might have a water use population model predicting water use, right? And obviously the information domain is very different in the main to a model that is looking at climate change affecting the demand, the supply rather of water that will be available. So they seem like models you could factor out straight away because they seem to me like to be different domains. They have their own local domain. And so rather than try to integrate them, we could actually let them be decoupled and try to have an organizational solution that is able to exploit each pocket of certainty relatively autonomously, and then deal with the obvious problem of the overlap, when it emerges, which is the contention for decision making, or the stress, if you like, in that decoupled metamodular system. So we're looking at it as a prediction exploitation problem now, rather than simply a prediction problem. And as I said earlier, you could have a certain kind of long-range trend of a certain type of information, like the expected volatility or something like that, and that could help you to set the budgets of those kind of like local models, or those component models. And you could also then start trying to exploit more short-range forecasts. So you create an organizational structure in each domain that is better at exploiting short-term information. Now, whether that is at all feasible in this policy area, I actually don't know. But we would then aim for responsive short-term plans to exploit those remaining pockets of short-term certainty. And the fact that we factored out the models should make that easier to do, because they should be focused on particular kinds of decisions that we're trying to take more autonomously of the other components of the system. Now, there's a remaining kind of unfactored uncertainty or complexity where the two models interact. For example, you have quite high demand and quite low supply. Individually, each model might handle that, but together, that's stressing the system. It's the intersection of the demand stress and the supply stress which is causing the problem. And so you then have a separate model for the intersection, for a kind of stress response. And this is what I think happens in biological systems. I think they're metamodular, which is why stress responses are so important in biology, because of this unfactored complexity and this generalized solution. So either model could potentially take control of the whole system, given confidence that it has to, if you see what I mean. So we're not saying that it's multi-modular, where each component has its very precise, crisp domain. We're saying it's metamodular, like the car example, where the emergency braking system can take over the whole car. And so that's what we're trying to create, something similar to what's really a metamodular process. Yeah, so I've already said these things, but I think that this is the fundamental type of stuff, which is the mathematics of nature's risk management solutions. Now, the enemy of this is obviously if the system is very sensitive to the order that you do things, so permutation sensitivity, because what you don't have is this tacking between models doesn't give you sensitivity to a solution that relies on a very specific ordering of events. And so we lost some of the true complexity of the problem when we created a metamodular process that doesn't have a unique ordering that is predicted to be best. But you've got to understand that we've respected the true uncertainty in the system. And so there's no good saying, in theory, this is the best order of events, when actually you haven't really managed to squeeze out the true uncertainty there. So this is more like an illusory solution to me, where you know the best ordering of events. And you still plan for things, you still plan for what to do when the system is stressed. So it's all about preparation. And then you also have the possibility of fractional delivery, and the mathematics then can support the analysis of a solution where you partially build with the option of completing it given certain events. And that can be a very, very good way to, excuse me, that can be a very good way to actually be able to be more agile and exploit a pocket of uncertainty, pocket of certainty, because you've fractionally delivered something. And so I think that's a really important strategy that you could use in infrastructure. So prediction exploitation suits distributed meta-modular systems better. That's my argument. And I did have a look on the internet, and I did find this mention of adaptation for deep uncertainty in urban water management, and the idea that we have a hybrid system with many decentralized elements. So some elements of water management could naturally be decentralized. And so that does mean that this is actually a PhD for looking at how to integrate that decentralized system, hybrid system, into a strategy for deep uncertainty. And this is exactly what I've kind of talked about here, is how you would in fact do that. So I'm not saying I'm going to do this PhD, but I'm just saying that that actually I think that whoever does this PhD should probably read my book, because that's kind of what I'm arguing, how we can do that. And so that's it really. So I just kind of like summarize the advantages of reading my book, if kind of seeing the options available to you, thinking about outside of your own niche, understanding capacity for change. And it's kind of a business economics book as well as a popular science book. And my argument is that you're in the reality of how to exploit pockets of certainty wherever they remain, not the game of squeezing out uncertainty wherever it actually remains. And so that is how I would like to finish.